Let's move on to your first book, Kite Runner. We know that this was somewhat based on your personal experience. You've given many interviews about the book and said that you grew up watching kites fly. You flew kites yourself. Tell us about what life was like for you as a child growing up in Kabul. I mean, you really, I think, vividly capture the experience of flying a kite in the Kite Runner. And I'd love for you to expand on what it was like for you to fly kites as a young kid. Were you competitive in doing it?
Well, yeah, we were all competitive. No, for me, the kites are kind of emblematic of a time and an era in Afghanistan that is now bygone. Before bin Laden, before the Soviets, before landmines, before 9/11, before the war on terror, before suicide bombs. You know, for most of the 20th century, Afghanistan was a country that lived at peace. And it was largely an anonymous country. I remember the tremendous shock I felt the first time in France when somebody asked me where I was from, and I told them, and they had no idea where it was. And it was startling to me. And it was, it was a very, very different place. Nowadays, if you say the word Afghanistan, it brings to mind sort of very familiar images, of guys hiding out in the caves of Tora Bora, the helicopters and dust and mountains. And that's what Afghanistan has become for a lot of people. The fact is that there was an Afghanistan before all of this happened. It's actually a gorgeous country. Yes, there are deserts and there are mountains, but in the north it's lush. There are forests, there are trees, there are woods, there are beautiful valleys. And it's a gorgeous country. And growing up in Kabul in the 70s, I never heard a gun go off. I mean, I never saw a tank move. We left our home for 2 weeks one time. We forgot to lock our door. It came back and nothing was taken. It really was a different place. There was a thriving cultural life, a burgeoning intellectual life, an artistic life. For me, one of the most startling things in terms of contrast, the way I was raised and what Afghanistan has become now, was in 2003. I went to Afghanistan and I saw a math textbook in a bookstore, which was used for, third graders or whatever in the 90s. And the typical kind of, I flipped through it and there's a word problem, and it went something like, if you have 60 grenades and 20 mujahideen, how many grenades per mujahideen do you get? I mean, and this has become such a part of the culture. There's an entire generation or two of Afghans now that have been raised amid conflict and war, and for them, the Afghanistan of my childhood, where I flew kites, has become a distant memory. For me, the kites are symbolic of that time, and mainly because I flew them with all my cousins and my brother, and there was a whole world and a whole universe built around the sport of kite flying for us. It was very carefree, and it was innocent, and it was fun, and for me, they kind of are harbingers of that era.
So much. How much of Amir's story then is your story, would you say?
I think there are broad parallels between his life and mine, in our upbringing and where we grew up and when we grew up. But ultimately, I'm not him. Certainly, in the passages in the U.S. where Amir goes to, Northern California with his father, and they're trying to start this new life. It's very reminiscent of my own life, because we went through the same period of trying to adjust to this new culture. I remember the flea market, and my dad and I had this van, and we would go to the garage sales and buy all this junk, and then the next day on Sunday we would go to the flea market and sell it. And soon we started noticing other Afghans were doing the same thing, and all of a sudden there was like a corner of that market that was sort of the Afghan corner, and we'd be there and there'd be Afghan music and Afghan food. And I remember there was somebody across the aisle that was a colleague of my father's, or somebody there that was a college professor, and they were all there, selling sewing machines and old tennis rackets and old records. And for me, I felt that was such a vivid image, and could be the nucleus of the immigrant section of that novel. But ultimately, I'm not him. I have kind of a funny problem in the sense that, and sadly we've seen people who've written quote-unquote memoirs that really turn out to be novels. Notorious last few years. I've written a novel that I insist is a novel, but people keep saying, it's a memoir. I have the reverse problem. I was at a book signing once, and for those of you who haven't read the book, at the end of it, there's a boy named Sohrab that the hero goes to Afghanistan to rescue. And if that's a spoiler, then you deserve it. You haven't read it. But the boy comes back he brings the boy back to the U.S. and there's and how he actually assimilates is kind of left up in the air. So I was at a book signing, and this lady comes up, and in a very, very earnest, sincere way, she leaned in, she goes, how is Sohrab doing? And I said, well, he's not real, it's a novel, he's a fictional character. And she goes, really, how is he doing? And I saw that, she wasn't. I said, he's doing great. He's doing really good. And she goes, well, you tell him we're praying for him. So there's bits and pieces of me all over the pages, and there are pages where I'm completely gone from the story.
You've mentioned many times before that the Kite Runner, for anyone who reads it, is a very human, universal story. I believe that. I think any person that reads the Kite Runner can identify not with the story or the background, but with the raw human emotion that you feel as you read those pages. Is that how you wanted the book to read, or did it just come out that way? I mean, did you have a preconceived notion that I'm going to make this emotive?
No, for me, it never works like that. I don't have a global big plan in that sense. I sit to write the story, and I'm really just kind of following the thread and narrative. And as I'm writing, I begin to see possibilities, and I begin to see themes emerging that I didn't expect at all to see. And suddenly, as I wrote this book and I was finishing the first draft, I realized that, wow, this is. I thought it was going to be this very kind of nostalgic story about two boys who love to fly kites, and I really didn't know where the story was going. And suddenly it became a book about fatherhood, about being a son, about brotherhood, about losing your homeland, about guilt, loss, friendship, betrayal, redemption, all these things that I never saw kind of came left field. And I realized that this is what the book has turned out to be. I didn't set out to do that. And as I wrote it, I also realized that it has become also a story about kind of a chronicling of this unending conflict in Afghanistan and of the suffering of the Afghan people, which also I hadn't set out to really do. But once the manuscript was done, I realized that's kind of what the book has become.